Support comes from UT's Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, featuring miles of trails and nearly 900 native plant species. More about the official Botanic Garden of Texas at wildflower.org.
Howdy, folks. Today we're speaking with Kelly Norris. Now, we hear a lot about local ecology, but what can we do at ground level in our very own yards? Visionary horticulturist Kelly here celebrates stylish naturalistic gardens that connect us to the land under our feet. At home in Iowa, he banished his turf grass to restore his yard as a lively prairie wildlife habitat, something very near and dear to my heart. For 8 years, he served as Director of Horticulture and Education at the Greater Des Moines Botanical Garden. In his latest book, New Naturalism, Designing and Planting Resilient, Ecologically Vibrant Home Gardens, he guides us through the process to create a nature of place wherever we live. Hello, Kelly.
Hello, John Hart. It's my pleasure to be with you.
So excited to talk to you today. I totally nerded out when your book came out, and I ordered it, pre-order. Was so happy to get it, and I really appreciated your take on gardening. Again, I'm a prairie nerd, so I'm 100% biased, and definitely you're going to get a one-sided argument from me. And I want to start out with a quote, and I know I'm not looking at the camera, but I had to read this because you have some just really wonderfully written passages in here, and the first one really is: instead of arriving at a finish line at the end of the growing season, what if the garden became a place where nearly an infinite number of life cycles informed our planting choices? What if we look at these cycles that take place season after season if we begin with this process? You call yourself a plantsman, having an artist's heart on a scientist's head. So you've got the two disciplines going on there. But, you know, starting with this passage, what is new naturalism?
I think new naturalism is a moniker for the moment in so many ways. We are having a different kind of conversation about gardening today than we've had in maybe the Western world in recent history. We're talking about gardens in a way that are not removed from the nature of place. We're talking about gardens as places themselves that can foster life beyond simply things that are just pretty. We are interested in the wildness and the romantic spirit of plants and what they do when we create places of that nature. And so we have design, and we have art, and we have ecology, and we have plants, and we have gardening. We have all of these things that we've sort of convened at this table today. And so I think new naturalism sort of puts an umbrella over all of that and kind of reflects in some ways on behalf of the home gardener, or in conversation with the home gardener through the text, about how that comes to be manifested in your garden at home.
Your garden, let's talk about that for a minute. Even though you are in Iowa and we're in Texas, your philosophy extends beyond that region. Your own garden, Three Oaks Garden, is a wonderful example. The Long Look Prairie, I love that name. What inspired it?
I think you make a good point. I think there's two questions there. One, this whole conversation about new naturalism is in some ways completely agnostic to place, and yet is entirely and completely about place at the same time. So it's a strategy. It's not a stylistic overture. And I think that's one of the things that can be a bit confusing to wrap your mind around a bit, is that as gardeners, we tend to gravitate towards aesthetic styles. We tend to think about formal versus informal, and cottagey versus modern. We have these very kind of binary ways of categorizing ways we think about plants. And I'm not here to debate any of that. I'm actually to jump maybe one step above or below, depending on your philosophy, is to think, how do we just approach with a different strategy about making gardens that's rooted in some awareness of place, plants' interactions with place, and then the interactions with plants themselves, and then the whole diversity of creatures that call our gardens home too. So Three Oaks here at home is in some ways my kind of messy artist's garden, is sort of working studio camp to sort of explore some of these ideas. I guess every garden I've ever made in my life, for myself or for public space or for clients or whatever, is just sort of, keeps chipping away at these ideas about how we as gardeners interact with place, how plants interact with place, and then each other.
I love books that take complex subjects and break them up into discernible pieces that, let's just cut through all this sort of jargon and just really hit at the heart and the source of, the subject. I want to start first with that nature of planting. I love how you phrase it. Plants are up to something, and it's up to us to know those plants and how they grow and survive and thrive and disperse, as you put it. Why is it so fundamental to know plants, and how can that not be a scary subject for somebody who's going to jump from, hey, I've done formal planting all my life, I'm
Sure.
going wild, I buy in?
Yeah, I think it is a bit of a hurdle to cross. It may not be the tallest one as a gardener, but I think you're right. I think that we've so often treated plants as kind of inanimate objects. Full sun, well-drained soil, yellow flowers in July. I mean, we kind of tend to sort of piece them together as if they're kind of static parts, sort of swatches on a mood board or something like that. And they're not. They're alive. They're creatures. They have a life history. They have natural heritages. They have interactions with place and land. And you don't have to, as a gardener, have to have a degree in ecology to necessarily understand all of this or to know all of this. There's actually a great deal of these things in maybe unlikely places for a gardener to find them, places like field guides that tell you something about like where plants actually grow in the wild. And that's sort of, I think, one of the major themes in the first part of the book is trying to sort of understand plants in maybe their native place, in their wild place, and then understand how that relates to your place at home. Because place is it's strange for only being one chapter of the book really dedicated to it. It could have as well been a whole, and maybe it will be a whole nother book on itself because place is complicated and place is messy. And place is changing even as we're talking about it because of climate change and because of human activities. And so the way we think about gardening with place or site-specific planting design is more than just quaint phrases like right plant, right place. There's lots of plants that we can ascertain to be right. It's sort of like sustainable. Right, everything is sustainable with the right amount of resources, and that in itself is the resources are the problem, and so we don't have enough of them. So that's why resiliency comes into it. Sidebar there, but the same aspect is true. I think of understanding plants is, and I sort of turn that right plants, right place idea on its head at a point in the book. And what about place first? I mean, what do we need to understand first about place that makes this right? And what plants really belong here in this place, given what we know about it? In some ways, my work, both is in practice and then in the book and in writing, is to start to poke the badger a little bit and start to change the way people think about what they see. Because there's a lot to see in the world. And as you noted at the outset of this is a complex subject. It's actually not meant to be simple. It in some ways, I don't know, isn't supposed to be easy. I don't want it to be intimidating either, but we want to inspire people's curiosity. We want people to dig in a little bit deeper and ask questions about plants and really get to know them.
Again, you say, most importantly, ecological garden isn't an attempt to recreate some pristine version of nature, but rather to embrace the nature of the garden itself. Right.
And I think so often, we have words in our language like restoration, and we have a need sometimes to look backwards, strangely, as a way to move forward. And I sometimes just like to sort of cut that step out. There's no backward looking in natural processes. There's just motion. It's really not even about forward. It's just in motion. And these systems, these gardens that we could create in this way are dynamic in that way. They can, when we see this as gardeners all the time, we see the plants that flourish in dry years. We see the plants that exert themselves in wet years. We see these sort of reactions of the landscape to the world around them. And so some of this is taking the observations you have as a gardener, the intuitions you have developed from, bent over, sweating and crying and bleeding and whatever, you do in the garden to sort of make it whatever it is to take those observations and just sort of add on another layer of maybe science to it, a sort of something that starts to explain the phenomena that we observe as gardeners.
Let's talk about the planting palettes, the other half, where you really start to get into, okay, we've had this discussion of understanding. Now it's about really applying. And I really encourage the viewers to go get this text, because not only is there a great amount of thought put into the text and the structure of the text, but the images that you have to really demonstrate exactly what you're talking about. Because this new type of gardening can be confusing and complex, but when you see it paired with your writing, I think is just wonderful. So I think maybe we just pull out for today 3 primary design concepts in New Naturalism. So you talk about matrix, so you talk about sedges and grasses, you talk about structure plants, the shrubs, the trees, perennials, and then vignettes, so your flowering plants and nectar sources. Can you just talk about that a little bit, about how you came up with that framework? Because it's really interesting.
I've been working in that sort of typology for a long time. And I will say just at the outset, only because I hear sometimes people say things about the palettes, they're not meant to be prescriptive. They're archetypal, right? I mean, there's nobody in the world that can take that entire archetype or any of those recipes and apply them directly. I mean, that's not what they're meant to do. They're meant to start to get you thinking about plants in these layers of the landscape, which you articulated, that our matrix, our structure, and our vignettes. And this actually goes back to my previous book, Plants with Style, and I talked a lot about and maybe this was, this is part of the artist and the writer kind of working these things out. I started really thinking about the landscape in layers a long time ago, and being aware of the fact, both as somebody who has a lot of experience in the field, as well as, actually like plants in the wild field, but then also, plants in gardens, sort of understanding what was similar between these two conditions. And one of the things, or what could be similar between these two conditions. And so in the wild, plants inherently, in almost any place in the world, grow at a density so often that is somewhat foreign to the horticultural context. I mean, even in the great state of Texas, where there's of course a panoply of really wonderful environments. I love botanizing in Texas. It's an incredible flora. It's an incredible part of the world where these sorts of all these kinds of different ecological ideas come to kind of clash in one big geographic area. And so, so even in a desertified environment, let's think like West Texas, like the Davis Mountains and Marfa and that kind of thing, you still find plants growing in layers defined by the environment. Now, so the matrix layer is really the principal foundation work. I start with that first because it's the layer that is so often missing from the traditional horticultural conversation. It's the layer that is replaced by inert things or by mulches, or it's instead really, should be living mulch. It should be green mulch. It should be plants doing that work at that kind of base foundational layer of the landscape. That's the matrix that sort of holds it all together. The structure starts to get a little easier to recognize because we plant trees, we plant shrubs, we put frames around things, and we kind of use vegetation to see through and provide this sort of skeleton around which things like vignettes, sort of all the Pinterest things, the Instagram, the little plant combinations and postcards we collect, because those are the kinds of emotional interfaces of vegetation in the landscape. Those are the things that are easiest. So with matrix structure vignettes are easy. We got that. Everybody's got that now. Color, texture, form, blah, blah. Everybody's got that. That's the stuff that we already know as gardeners. Right. It's every layer below that, or at least in reverse chronology here as we've described it today, that becomes maybe a little foggier with respect to why do we use plants in that way, or how do we use plants in that way. So I find, that's plants don't read the same books we do, right? So I haven't consulted them on this exactly, but as a hierarchy
check out Yelp.
As a hierarchy goes, it is broadly applicable to a lot of plant communities in a lot of places.
Sure. I'm big on prairie gardening, and that's something that I think, again, people tend to be afraid of grasses because a flower, you got it. Like you're saying, this vignettes, easy. I know what that is, but grasses require a little bit more. But the graminoids, they really, even in a historic community, we're 50% or more of that. Or so more. I just love your appreciation and then linking that to a living mulch, because I haven't really thought about that, but that's exactly what they're doing. So why plant young plants and seeds? Because I just want to go to the store and get my instant garden.
Right. Well, so many people do, and that's I think that's fine too. But I think if you're somebody who is wanting to really get into this in a meaningful way, and you're wanting to maybe tackle a larger than average garden bed or garden space, and you want to do so in some kind of economically reasonable fashion, smaller makes a lot of sense practically, economically speaking. It's easier on the pocketbook, but it's actually easier on plants too. What we're finding in so many applications, and in some research that's happening, is that for a lot of herbaceous perennial plants, there's some real physiological advantages to planting smaller examples of a given species compared to the 1 or 2 gallon size things we so often see at the garden center when we go shopping. It's not that those larger sizes are bad. It's just
Right.
that in comparison to something that's smaller, like a landscape plug, or something that has a deep root system and a relatively small sort of piece of vegetation on top of it. You're
Right.
talking about something that might have a root ball that's 2.5 or 3 inches in diameter in some measurement, compared to something that maybe has a root ball mass of like 8 or 10 inches or something.
Yeah.
Actually, this sort of small example, these plugs on this smaller end of the situation have really a better balance between the root system that's available and the vegetation that's up there. So often in a bigger plant, and they're making some, this is general broad brushstrokes here. It's not uniformly applicable, but this is generally true. In that you have a large plant, you have a volume of soil and a certain volume of roots, and you have all this top growth, which has often been fertilized and artificially kind of juiced up for sale and whatever. I mean, it's just how we make plants in greenhouse and nursery settings. When you, as a gardener, go and plant that in the landscape, oftentimes the amount of vegetation, we're talking about biomass now, not necessarily just what you can see, the amount of vegetation that exists above ground in that bigger example is often way more than that root system can support without all of the sort of other things that came along with it in a container production scenario. So suddenly it's on its own when it's in your garden, and that's a challenge. So what happens then is not that the plant maybe struggles, it may just do just fine, but actually it spends sometimes upwards of an entire growing season or more kind of recalibrating all of that, like building out a better root system, and as a response to the disturbance of all that. All this is to say that smaller comes at the advantage of being cheaper per unit and actually faster to establish. Or to put it as a comparison, if you plant species A, small plant, big plant, 12 months later, they're probably going to be the same size, and you've paid a third for the small plant.
In smaller gardens, why should we want to consider or think about perspectives even? I mean, right, that's a smaller garden. I can just sort of lump some stuff together and it's pretty. Why consider perspective?
Well, look, I think the world as we know it, in this country especially, is really affected at the landscape level, 0.2 acres at a time. That's the median lot size in this country is just shy of 1/4 of an acre, basically, average across the entire country. In urban areas, certainly a lot smaller than that. So I guess I turn that around to say, I think that, you as a home gardener out there, wherever you're at, your little 1/10 of an acre or 2/10 of an acre lot, that's the unit of change that we can make a difference in with the world. If you add up all the public land in the US, it's a pittance compared to what's owned by people like you and I and our neighbors down the street. And so if we really want to make a difference in the world and change the way our landscapes function, and they have to change because our cities are under stressors and pressure from climate change. And so the future of our cities is going to require more vegetation in order for them simply to be livable for us, much less anything else that we might share them with. And so, why not then take the chance, 0.2 acres or 0.1 acre at a time, to plant the world a more beautiful, functional place? And to, ecology happens no matter the scale and whether we are aware of it or like it or not. I mean, plants in place are doing something. And so as a gardener, I'm just challenging you to sort of maximize the capacity of what they're doing, both for us, just because we like being in gardens and love looking at gardens, but for all of the creatures in the world that they can support, and just for the greater sort of functioning of the ecosystem, stormwater capturing and pollution control, and all these things that plants do for us in the world as it is. Just turn the volume up in your home garden.
We've sort of talked about the two of the major components that I think it's really important for people to dive in, but you have a lot more material. You have plant lists and design examples. Would you like to really briefly just talk about, what else that you're just packing in this punch of a text?
There's only so many pages when you write a book like this, and I'm sure there's way more to write. But I think the book tries to, and the way that I like to teach as well too, builds on a method. So starting with an understanding of plants, and then an understanding of place, and then sort of like, okay, so what do you do with plants, and then what techniques do you sort of borrow from this new knowledge or these new observations to put a garden together, and then as you say, the palettes in the last half of the book. are meant to sort of be these archetypal recipes. And it's like when I cook, I don't really follow a recipe sometimes. I take something that's a good recipe and I riff on it a little bit. A little more of this because I'm in the mood for it. You're meant to take the palettes and start to get kind of curious and get local with them. Right. I read a review from somebody on Amazon that my publicist forwarded to me that said, "Oh, I didn't talk about native plants enough." And I was like, "Native to who and to where? I'm writing a book for a global audience." The point is that you're supposed to take these ideas about plants in place, these different strategies about gardening, and get local with it and sort of take that recipe and go, like you'd go to the farmer's market to pick up your little, Saturday afternoon, late lunch or something, go to the nursery and start to really dig deeper into that palette of plants that you may be surprised, actually, that you already know. I mean, we have come so far in 30 or 40 years in integrating native plants into our horticultural trade. I think it's a label that sometimes actually can get it in the way now of understanding things. Yes, it's incredibly important to know where plants are from and to build landscapes at a local level with 75 or 80% natives in a foundational kind of way. But, oftentimes we're growing native plants. I find some people are growing natives don't even know it because they're just plants in our trade. And so I don't want us to get into a thing where we're checking passports and what plants at the garden gate kind of thing. I mean, I'd rather us get to a place that we're talking about how do we use plants and not just lining them up in mulch in front of our house. Because even if every one of those plants, John Hart, was native and they're lined up in a little row in mulch, they're still not as functional as 75% of my front yard sort of stacked up, layered up in this complex sort of fun system. And so, we have to do more than just simply check, I've planted natives. No, but what have you done with them and what are they doing in place?
How can our viewers connect to follow you and learn more and some of your earlier texts that you've mentioned? And I know you've got other information out there. How can they hook up with you?
KellyDNorris.com is kind of the nerve center, I suppose. But I'm pretty active on Instagram, which is just my full name, Kelly D. Norris. You can buy the book on my website. You can buy the book wherever books are sold. Quite frankly, if you order it through me, you can get it signed and whatever. And I hope to hear from people. I love Central Texas. Like I said, I love Texas. Period. My grandparents actually live in the Rio Grande Valley, and so I've spent a fair amount of time in Texas and love the flora, love the landscapes, and there's a great passion for gardening. I think that's really a lot of folks in Texas have been talking about site-specific local landscapes for a long time because your climate is such that you had to confront it maybe in a more harsher way than some other parts of the country are just now maybe having to. So I think you all are doing some great work down there, and it's been a pleasure to share some of that with some of my thoughts with you all on that today.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with us on Central Texas Gardener today, and hopefully we'll be speaking with you pretty soon.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.